This happened in the late fall when I was in my junior year of high school. I skipped school that day because I told my mom I wasn't feeling well. I most definitely exaggerated when I told her I was sick. I wasn't physically sick, I just really wasn't feeling the best that day in general, and I really wanted to skip school. Fast forward to the middle of the day. Probably around noon, I heard this creepy, high-pitched laughter that sounded like it was coming from outside. At first, I just assumed it was our neighbor, but as the laughter continued, I couldn't help but feel creeped out. I worked myself up, and I started to get this weird feeling inside, almost like something bad was about to happen. I made my way over to my window and peeked outside through the blinds, and right away, I saw an older lady standing right before me, literally within 3 inches away. I basically screamed in fear.
"What do you want?"
I asked. She had this disturbing, perplexed look on her face and this distinct smile that I will never forget. The only thing separating us was the glass window. I then moved my head away from the window and closed my blinds. This all happened in a matter of 10 seconds or less. I walked out of the room and attempted to gather my thoughts. I called my mom, and she said I better wait on calling the police and to call them if the lady gave me any more problems. I went back to my room and I looked out of the window again, and she was gone. I felt an immense amount of relief after that. I knew I wasn't 100% in the clear, though. I looked through all the windows in the house just to make sure she wasn't on our property anywhere else. And to my luck, thankfully, she didn't appear to be anywhere. The rest of the day went on just fine, and nothing more of the old lady came about. But a few days later on Saturday night, it was around 11 o'clock, I assume, I got startled and jumped out of my seat when I heard someone knocking on my window. Right away, my first thought was that the old lady was back. I yelled out to her and told her to go away. I didn't even look out the window this time. She then started laughing again. I then yelled at her loud enough to wake my parents, apparently, because my dad rushed over to my room and asked me what was going on. By now, the laughing and knocking had completely stopped, and I was too scared to explain. So I just pointed at the window and put my finger up to my lips, implying that we needed to be quiet. My dad confusingly walked over to my window and opened the blinds. He was met with the same woman that I saw a few days earlier. She began screaming at us, and she reached behind herself to grab a knife and started flashing it all around at us. This woman was screaming at the top of her lungs, but we had no idea what the hell she was saying. She then opened the window and tried to climb through the window, but because of her old age, she couldn't get herself up in time before my dad pushed her back and shut and locked the window. He called the police, and surprisingly enough, the old woman was still on our property when they arrived. It's my understanding that she rolled her ankle pretty badly and wasn't able to walk much by herself. I think she just gave up and accepted defeat and thought she was going to be arrested. She told the police that she was going to kill us, and she unraveled her entire plan to the officer in an interrogation at the station. The most disturbing thing to me about this story is that this woman had to have been around 70 years old. Crime doesn't have an age limit, I guess, and neither does the horrible things that human beings can do. It's quite clear that she was clinically insane, and my presumption, without a doubt, was correct, that she was elderly and losing her mind. Apparently, she had been living next door in a house that was foreclosed that we thought was completely unoccupied. We had only been living in our home for 2 months tops when all this happened, and there's no telling how long she had been really living in that house. She told police she was there for a few weeks, but we never got much more information than that. It's disturbing to think how long she had been planning this for and how things could have went a lot differently if it weren't for my dad. I made sure to check that my window was locked now, more than I'd like to admit. I finally bought my first house when I was 28 years old. It was in a rough part of town and considerably not the safest neighborhood to live in. You definitely get what you pay for, and I learned my lesson with that. Within my first month of living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened at all, and I was definitely getting settled in, and I thought that I could get used to it, you know? Like, living there. But all that changed quickly. I met the neighbors, and I would have quick, light-hearted small talk with them here and there, but nothing more. Everyone surprisingly seemed quite normal despite the neighborhood that we were in. Of course, There was just one guy that was an oddball out of the few. He lived a couple of houses down in a pretty small and beat-up looking house. Even more beat up than the others, including mine. He was probably around 45 years old, I'd say. And he always gave me the heebie-jeebies from the exact second I first laid eyes on him. He was average height, a bit overweight, barely had any hair, and almost always wore the same rather dirty-looking clothes. He tried speaking with me a number of times, even though I wasn't very interested in talking to him. I let him rant to me a handful amount of separate times, and he would chat my ears off about the most random and quite unusual things. There's something very off-putting about him. For example, one time I got home from the grocery store and he was walking on the sidewalk towards his house. He stopped and turned around when I pulled into the driveway, and he began talking to me. He started talking about his dead mother and how he hated her and how she was a horrible woman. He seemed very angry and was almost yelling while he was telling me this. Another time, I was sitting on my porch with one of my buds, and he saw us sitting outside and practically invited himself over. He even cut me off while I was talking, and he began yelping about something that happened to him at work. He was a dishwasher at some restaurant, and he was telling us both about how he hates it there and wants to quit. He then started making racist comments about some of the workers there. It was at this point I didn't care about being nice anymore, and I walked inside and signaled to my friend Brendan to come inside with me. I shut and locked the door behind us, and I peeked out my living room window, and thankfully he was walking away. Brendan and I were so bewildered about what had just happened that we started laughing uncontrollably because it was just so weird. Fast forward to later that night, Brendan had too many drinks, so we thought it would be best for him to crash at my place for the night. I had him sleep on the couch because the guest bedroom didn't have a bed in the room yet. At some point in the night, as I was lying in bed, probably about to drift off to sleep soon, I heard a knock on the front door. I looked through the peephole, and I saw that it was the same creepy guy that never seemed to leave me alone. My instinct was to ignore it, but my buddy Brendan said, "Maybe you should just open it, bro, to see what he wants." I kind of sighed, but the man seemed to be afflicted, so I thought the right thing to do would be to open the door and see what he wanted. What he was asking for completely threw me off guard and, quite honestly, angered me immensely. He asked me for $50. I looked at him like he was crazy, and I told him no. I don't have $50 lying around to just give out like that. He said okay and apologized for asking. I thought that was going to be the end of it, so I attempted to shut the door, but he reached out and managed to put his arm between the door and leaned up against it.
Wait, if you don't have any money, can you at least help me out with something? Like food, it could be anything. Just some sort of snack or something that will get me by for the rest of the night. Please.
I thought about helping him, but I was over this guy's games, and I didn't have much food to offer anyway. With it being 11 o'clock at night, I was already pretty bothered by the whole situation in general. So I looked him dead in the eye and firmly told him no and that he needed to leave. I figured I wasn't obligated to feed this man, nor was I obligated to even speak with him if I didn't want to. I went to shut the door again, and that's when he bursted through and tackled me. Brendan got up immediately and pulled him off of me, and the man ended up running away. He probably realized he was outnumbered and didn't stand a chance in a fight with us. When he left, I saw that he had a gun tucked in his pants on his backside, and I couldn't believe it. Was this man going to try and rob me? Or maybe kill me? At this point, something told me that he was wanted by the police because I told the neighbor about what happened a few days later, and she was shocked. Then she shocked me even more because when I told her about the guy and what happened, she said that nobody lived in that house and that it had been abandoned ever since before she lived there, which was over 5 years at the time. I called the police, and they found nothing in the home or around it outside that would give the slightest clue as to what was going on. I think that he was most definitely squatting there for a place to live. Well, I still to this day haven't heard anything regarding the situation that happened to me, and I can't say for sure what would have happened had I been alone that night. I don't live in that house anymore, and I've been moved out for 3 years now. I had just graduated high school, and I was 18 years old. I had been saving up money for almost a full year to finally get into my own apartment. My dad co-signed for me, and I was ready to be on my own. The rent was reasonably priced, and I was going to have my own space. The apartment was only a short walk away from the college where I was about to be a freshman at, so a lot of the tenants were students that went to the same school. I met a couple of friends that shared similar interests, and we would hang out from time to time. There was this one guy, though, who always seemed weird. None of us knew who he was, but we always seemed to see him, it felt like, no matter what we were doing. He would ride around on his bike every day, and we would always run into him one way or another. He would stare at us very menacingly, and we kind of wrote him off as a neighborhood creep. One night when I was fast asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds of yelling and screaming. The walls were paper thin, and that's why I could hear what was going on so well. It was very clear to me that it was coming from the apartment next to mine. My neighbor was a woman that was around my age, and all I could hear was her telling someone to leave over and over again. My first instinct was to knock on the door myself and see if I could be of any help to the girl. But the screaming died down shortly after, and I thought it was none of my business. So maybe it was best to stay out of it. I somehow managed to fall back asleep, and when I woke up in the morning around 8 o'clock, I had this sinking feeling in my chest that something was wrong. I made my way over to my neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door, and finally, after knocking 4 or 5 times and waiting forever, someone finally opened the door. They only cracked it open just a bit, just enough for them to peek their eye out and for me to see a small part of their head. It was dark in there, unusually dark, so I couldn't really make out who I was talking to. "Hey, everything all right in there?" I asked. The guy quickly grew defensive and asked me what I was talking about. I told him to cut the crap, and I straight up told him I heard what happened last night with all the yelling and screaming. He immediately shut the door and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. Very angrily, I made my way back to my apartment, trying to figure out what I should do. I figured there was nothing I could do. I thought it was most definitely too late to call the police, so in a flurry, I decided to go back to my neighbor's apartment with the idea in my head that I was going to demand answers. I just had such a horrible feeling, and I couldn't just not do something about it. I knocked on the door once again, and the same person answered the door. This time much faster, and they opened it all the way. I was puzzled when I saw that it was the same creepy guy my friends and I always see around the neighborhood. "Dude, where's the girl?" "Huh?" he said. "I don't know." I told him that I needed him to stop lying and that I needed answers. I then smelled this horrible foul smell that was leaking out of the apartment. I told them that I knew the girl who lived there and that I wanted to see her to make sure she was okay. He told me I was crazy, and he shut the door once again. I was so frustrated at this point that I began kicking the door. I don't know if I was attempting to break in or not. It was just all sort of a blur when it happened. I was just so angry. The only thing I could do was call the police and tell them everything I knew. So that's exactly what I did. Police showed up and demanded entry, and what they discovered was next level unimaginable. They found the girl whose name was Kaylee, and her body was all chopped up with her arms, legs, and even her head completely dismembered from her body. I'm lucky I didn't have to see that, but ever since that day, my guilty conscience has been eating at me. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about this and beat myself up for what happened. Knowing I could have potentially saved her life is what hurts the most. The amount of shame I've felt and carried with me for the past 5 years has consumed me and completely changed me as a person. The man who killed her is now sitting in prison, by the way, and received a death sentence for what he had done. This happened to me a few years ago. It's a kind of a long story. I'm a female and was 24 years old at the time. I had just moved into a new apartment with my roommate, who was a 21-year-old female, while we were finishing college. It had a pretty nice porch in the front yard, so when it was warm outside, I would often hang out in the front and read. The apartment was a duplex, so we had the full top floor unit, and my neighbor underneath me had the full bottom floor. Most of the buildings around us were set up the same. One day, I was sitting outside when a neighbor from the building directly to the left of us introduced himself to me. He was good-looking, probably in his early 30s, and seemed nice and normal enough. He mentioned that he was married and had a daughter. and that they also lived in the top floor unit. He said that it was nice to have other young people in the neighborhood, and that maybe we could have drinks together sometime. I said sure in a trying to be nice, knowing we will probably never make plans kind of way, and didn't think too much of it. After that, I seemed to run into him constantly. I would go outside, and not even 5 minutes later, he would be getting the mail or grabbing something from his car or coming out to sit on his porch. There was always some seemingly innocent excuse that we bumped into each other, and he always wanted to chat. He became pretty insistent that he wanted to hang out. Just us. Never any mention of his wife being there. This made me uncomfortable, and I was ready with a vague excuse to brush him off. After one run-in with him, I left the house later to find a post-it note with his name and number on it taped to my door telling me to text him so we could make plans. I threw it away. I mentioned this to my roommate, and we both kind of shrugged it off and figured that even though he was weird, it still seemed relatively harmless. This is where it starts to get really creepy. It slowly became more and more obvious that bumping into each other all the time was not a coincidence. I had a night class one semester where I had to leave my apartment around 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday and Thursday nights. At this point, it was wintertime, so when I left, it was completely dark outside. Literally, as I would be turning around to lock my door, he happened to be stepping out of his apartment as well, always wanting to chat, trying to make plans, etc. This definitely bothered me, but I was still in denial that there was a chance he could be watching me, or knew when I would be leaving the house. One of these nights that I bumped into him, I came home from class and jumped in the shower. My roommate worked evenings, so I was home alone. The apartment buildings were so close together that I could see the creepy neighbor's kitchen pretty clearly from my bedroom window since we were both on the top floor. I usually had my blinds closed at night, but it had been sunny that day and the apartment across from me was completely dark. I just didn't think anything of it and was walking around in my towel, sitting on my bed, playing on my phone, etc. Out of nowhere, I see a flashing light in the window next to me. It took me a minute to register what was happening. Someone was taking photos of me from his kitchen window in complete darkness. I instantly closed my blinds, and not even a minute later, my doorbell rang. Again and again. At this point, I'm freaking out and realize it had to be him ringing my doorbell. I, of course, didn't answer, and called my roommate who told me she would be home soon. He probably rang my doorbell at least 10 times before giving up. Finally, my roommate came home and I told her what happened. We are sitting in my room on the edge of my bed talking. The blinds are pulled all the way down, except for maybe 4 to 5 inches on one window. And since we were sitting, I guess you could still kind of see us, but just barely. As we are talking, we see flashing lights in his window again, still completely dark in the kitchen. My roommate is like, "What the fuck?" and pulls the blinds all the way down. The doorbell starts ringing again. We both decided hell no to answering the door, and he probably rings about 10 times before stopping. The next night I had night class. My doorbell rings around 6:40, right when I usually leave. My heart literally froze, thinking there was no way it could be the dude from next door. The doorbell rings probably 6 or 7 more times. I didn't go to class that night. I consider calling the cops, but I am personally terrified of cops, so that is really a last resort for me. Soon after this, my parents came in town to visit, and I hesitantly told them what had been going on. I didn't want them to freak out, but of course they freaked out. My dad installed a motion detector light right above my front door and a massive sliding lock. Although it was against my wishes, my mom told my downstairs neighbor, a nice middle-aged lady who I knew also knew him. After this, the doorbell stopped ringing and I was able to successfully avoid him for a couple of weeks. One day, I think I'm in a clear walking from my car to my front door when he comes rushing out of his apartment. He was so quick, I really couldn't avoid him even though I kept walking to my door. He said he was sorry for scaring me and that he was only ringing my doorbell and flashing lights in my window to try and get me to come outside. Not sure why this is a valid reason though. He said he was actually moving and wanted to know if I wanted some nice bartending tools before he gave them away. I was honestly terrified of him and kind of frozen, but managed to say some type of no and go inside my apartment. When I left the house later, there was a box of bar tools on my porch. Finally, he moved away and I didn't have to worry about leaving my house all the time. I ran into my downstairs neighbor who apologized for what happened. She said he had lived next to them for a few years and had no idea he would do something like that. She also told me that the reason they moved was because he cheated on his wife and she left him and took their daughter.